Good afternoon. My name is Bob Messier. I am with SAS, which is a software company, analytic software company out of North Carolina. I'm going to be moderating the session today. We're talking about driving operations with analytics, and hopefully we'll give a few examples and have an open and lively discussion and share some best practices and some experiences. To my left, I have Brian Jones. I've got a cheat sheet here for the introduction, so I could barely submit my own introduction to memory, let alone this. Brian is Deputy Assistant Inspector General for Analytics at the U.S. Postal Service. He began his career with the Postal Service in 1984 for 17 years, worked in numerous operational areas before becoming the accounting manager for the Northern Virginia District. In 2001, Brian joined the U.S. Postal Service, OIG, as an auditor, and during the past 13 years has worked across 5 functional areas in leadership positions. Brian has led analytics group at the U.S. Postal Service, OIG, for the past 4 years. Brian's wide range of experience gives him unique perspective on business and culture in the U.S. Postal Service and USPS OIG. Brian, thank you. Dominic. Dominic is the Deputy Associate Administrator, Office of Information Integrity and Access, Office of Government-Wide Policy, U.S. General Services Administration, GSA. Dominic joined GSA's Office of Government-Wide Policy in February of this year to head up the Office of Information Integrity and Access. His portfolio there includes the Federal Identity Credentialing and Access Management, FICAM program, Section 508, and managing the .gov domain. He comes to GSA on detail from OMB's eGov office, where he started in 2008, and where he most recently served as eGov's Chief for Data Analytics and Reporting. At OMB, and in coordination with GSA, Dominic guided the implementation of several major high-profile transparency and transformation initiatives, including the IT dashboard, recovery.gov, usaspending.gov, and Business USA. And he's also well known for getting these projects done in rapid order. He got his start as a federal employee in 2007, the Department of Transportation, prior to which he served in the private sector of BAE Systems and Bearing Point, where he managed enterprise architecture, capital planning, security initiatives at various federal agencies. Thank you, Dominic. All right, to kick the session off, talk a little bit about analytics. Analytics is definitely a hot topic. That's the good news. And the bad news, I think analytics is somewhat broadly defined. So I want to share just some examples. I know we had earlier sessions today on cybersecurity, thinking about analytics and how can you do things with analytics, like some organizations are doing intrusion detection, where they're looking at patterns of behavior online to figure out where intrusions may be coming in. I've seen projects at the Hong Kong Efficiency where they've scraped 2 million emails coming in from a service center standpoint, look at all those texts, and be able to model that. And so they can figure out where are problems occurring using unstructured data, which is the largest growing volume of data. I've also seen different agencies use optimization analytics to figure out if we have X amount of cases coming in, how do we score the risk of all the cases against a finite number of social workers? And how do we allocate that workload based on the risk to the number of social workers we have? And obviously, there's lots of uses of analytics in the military, in particular, readiness. And the challenge for our country in readiness is how do we use analytics to change things, to move the needle? And how do we challenge status quo? Because analytics is going to be a huge challenge in terms of how you challenge the way we've always done things, because that's the way we've always done it. So I'm going to lead off with some open questions here, Brian. Why analytics? Why now?
Well, before I try to answer that, one of the fears of public speaking is that you lose your voice before you go on stage. Unfortunately, I got a cold over the weekend, so hopefully you'll bear with me. So why analytics? It's the obvious value, and it's hard to describe to one particular agency or organization or business what that looks like. But time after time after time, the thing that's made the adoption rate at our agency so high is because we're able to show something to the business owner and there's no doubt in their mind. They understand what they're looking at. They understand what it means, and their decision-making becomes so much easier, so much more easy than it has been in the past. So, and you know, in our organization, and I have to clarify, so we're with the OIG, Office of Inspector General for the Postal Service, so we have oversight of the Postal Service. So in our agency, what obvious value comes in is monetary impact. And Bob, you mentioned to be able to, you know, score everything that you're modeling, and whether it's contracts or whether it's healthcare providers or whether it's employees or whoever it is that mail, dollars, you know, we can score it all. And so what we've been able to do is monetary impact. Obviously, as an OIG, that's important to us. And when people in your organization question why you're in this business, if you can't show that there's a return, you know, then you're not really going to get started. So for us, it's work hour savings. It's being proactive as a law enforcement organization. So many times we wait for the phone to ring. And when you're able to be forward-leaning and you're able to look for people who are committing crimes instead of waiting for the phone to ring, those are just a few examples in our business of what our leaders, not only our leaders, but more importantly, our investigators and auditors on the front line look at this and say, wow, we need more of this. And that's why it's the obvious value.
Dominic, from your perspective, why analytics?
So, at its most fundamental, analytics is about providing confidence for decision makers to make better decisions. The question about why is, I think it's kind of a self-answering question. Why now? I think the technology is there. We've reached the days where data is ubiquitous and it's more available, and we have the analytical tools. So analytics isn't new, it's just more readily available now than it's ever been before. So
Brian,
why people just want to, in the federal government, we have a much more, we have a compelling need to make good decisions because they impact so many people, and we need to make decisions faster because the bureaucracy moves very slowly.
So Brian, you used the word adoption, and Dominic, you used the word confidence. So just some of the things I've seen in the past, I'm going to ask you how you've been able to get over some of these hurdles. Oftentimes, when you're using analytics, the results of analytics can be counterintuitive, against the grain of how we've always run a business or a department. I was sharing with Brian before we got on stage a personal story about, not that we had nothing better to do at work, but we did model 1,000 holes of my golf game. And truth be told, before we captured 5,000 of my shots, I had some assumptions about my game. And I've been playing since I was 4 years old. I've taken 250,000 swings, minimum, including whiffs. Most of us in this room probably have 5, 10, 15, 20 years of business experience. We know either the agency we work in, or we know a lot about the area we work in. And so I thought I knew a lot about my golf game, and I can tell you without a doubt that my 5 assumptions about my game were all wrong once we captured the data. And it was very difficult for me and my ego, I guess, to get over. And even in that simple example, using analytics on my golf game, even I ran into some challenges in believing that it's true. I mean, I was in denial. That's probably part of it. So tell me, you used the word adoption rate, and you said value to the business owner. Have you been in situations where you went back and you presented some analytic outcomes, and the business owner said, Brian, nah, that can't be? I mean, have you seen that?
Yes, as a matter of fact, in Ken Kokie's presentation this morning, he said, big data challenges what we know and how we know it. And so oftentimes we have the information, but we deliver it the wrong way. Okay, I'm not an investigator, nor am I an auditor. So for me to go tell somebody what this means is really going to set me back before we even start. So when you present information, to somebody, we try to do it in a way that it focuses the attention on the data itself or the outcome of the model as opposed to who's delivering the message. And then what we find is even when it seems so obvious that there's a decision to be made and there's so much opportunity, and you watch time after time after time people, and especially leaders in the organization, have a hard time changing the way that they do business. And it's to get people to think. And just to give you a practical example, and these are numbers off the top of my head, but if we have 4 programs that we investigate, and I have 100 investigators, and I've got 25 in each area, and they're scattered across the country, why are they there? Why 25? Well, I guess that's the way we always did it, or that's who the person, or intuitively, I'm the professional, I'm the leader, I kind of know how to, deploy my resources. But when your model returns, if you look at mail volume, and if you look at the type of mail that's coming through the system, and then you look at the risk over in healthcare, all of a sudden it becomes strategic when the head of investigations can say, you know what, there's a whole lot more return on investment on the healthcare side. Maybe I should redeploy somebody from financial fraud or mail theft to go here where the fire is burning, as opposed to how I've always done things. And so the adoption has come over a period of time, but once they make the decision, then they become truly reliant on the data, and they become our best customers.
Okay, great. Dominic, you used the word confidence. What have you seen in terms of your engagement with your clients, in terms of how do you build that confidence sometimes when the first output of analytics can be a leap from how we're currently operating?
So I really liked your example because, what you saw in your own specific case, the human brain is not wired for the truth. It's wired for survival. And the same thing with an organization. Every organization has its own interests at stake, and leadership aren't always interested in hearing the truth. Certainly in many cases are not interested in hearing the truth, especially when it's going to impact resource allocation and such. So, we need to be mindful of that as analytics practitioners. We cannot just go in like a bull in a china shop and expect that people are going to accept our analytics as the truth, as the holy grail. There has to be some amount of political savvy when we go into these new programs, especially in these early days. So I think the beauty is that it puts conventional wisdom at risk, but we should never underestimate the power of the system or the organization to reject analytics.
So if we talk about obstacles in adoption, and there's different dimensions, different types of obstacles. You've got people obstacles where you may not have enough capacity or skills. You could have technology obstacles, process obstacles, and culture obstacles. Dominic, which obstacle do you think that you run into the most, that you find most challenging?
Absolutely cultural. Analytics requires access to, obviously technical resources and skill sets. That's the easy part. And we're the government. We've got a lot of resources at our disposal. If we can make this, if we can make the case to get those resources. The hard part is when you require sharing across across organizations or parts of an organization. And the analytics of the future is big data analytics. It's going to require access to a bunch of data sets from a bunch of different places. I don't know about people in this room, but by far the most difficult task I've faced in trying to stand up analytics programs is getting other people to understand that I need access to their data. The first question is always why, instead of why not. So absolutely, organizational resistance is numero uno by far. Everything else is way down the list from there. Not to be ignored, but certainly if you don't factor in the organizational part and you don't get good executive sponsorship for what you're trying to do up front, you may as well forget everything else.
What do you see, Brian?
Well, my brain is telling me I should be careful with what I say here, but
Yeah, I know it's being recorded.
I've been here all day, and I've sat through a lot of the sessions, and I really like when you go to a conference and you see retired government workers talking about how the government needs to change. Well, I'm still in the government. And
I'm being too candid.
I'm telling you that leadership is the issue. Leadership. Within the culture, it's leadership. And that doesn't mean at the highest, necessarily just the highest point in the organization. It means people sitting in this room, because this is a risk worth taking. You will get a bloody nose, no doubt, but the value behind this is a no-brainer. And so we need people who quit using things as an excuse. I mean, whether it's the FAR, whether it's the Yellow Book, whether it's the IG Act, whatever it is that we human beings tend to add policy and our own policies and procedures onto that allow us not to do what these things allow us to do. So when you hear data matching or computer matching, or when your general counsel says no before they say yes, you really have to keep driving and say, that's really not acceptable. You know, there is a way to be successful with this, and even if people don't want to give you data, take whatever it is that they'll give you. We've had success with whatever people want to give us. So we need people who are willing in the government now, not to sit up here and say what we need is change and what we need is this and this. What we need are the people sitting here and the people we work for and the people we work with to drive this change. And that's really, you know, it's idealistic to a certain degree, but you know, we've seen a lot of success, and I can tell you that it works. So take a risk; it's worth it.
I'm with you. I think it can be done. I do a lot of work in the commercial space, and analytics is still in its infancy. While there are pockets within organizations like pharmaceuticals that use analytics to do clinical drug trials, there's pockets at the bank. It's really not broadly consumed. It's not like every single person that has a copy of Microsoft Excel is doing analytics, or Microsoft Office, or they're not. The challenge is, how do we get people there? I'd like to see, by show of hands, how many people have an analytics group or department within their organization. Actually, that's pretty good. So the question is, and you know what? It's interesting. I know
them questions then.
I know everyone here has probably used an analytic today, and they may not even have known it. How many people here have an umbrella with them? So most of you looked at the weather forecast today, right? And that weather is essentially, it's a forecasting algorithm that just produces a sun or a cloud with some text. And a lot of you have used a mathematical algorithm to do something in your day-to-day life. Some of you took action and actually got an umbrella. The rest of us said, I don't have to worry about my hair, I guess, so I just kind of let it go. So the question is, you know, you also have a lot of people here that the departments, they're in their infancy of getting started with analytics. How would you suggest to an organization, not just an organization, the people in the room, how would you suggest, how do you get started? Where would you start?
It all starts with a question. All analytics starts with trying to answer a business question or a set of business questions and build from there, and explain to your leadership that you need resources to answer that question, and explain the steps you'll need to go through to get there, I think. If you don't start with what you're trying to answer, you're never going to get there.
And the answer to that question has to be compelling. You know, so many times we're given projects to do, just do this. And there's really not a thought put into, well, when we get this finished, is somebody going to use it? Or is it going to answer that question? Or if it does, what is the value to the organization? And to add on to that, what Dominic was suggesting is a lot of the mistakes that we make are starting with the data, and instead of starting with the question. And I echo that. You have to start with the question.
So to ask a question, you have to be curious. So we've had discussions, the three of us, around the demand for analytic talent. And there is a huge demand for analytic talent. And at times it's hard to get that analytic talent. But I would argue, if you start with a question, what you really need is find people that are curious. And they're not just resting on status quo as being the answer. And Brian, I have an audit background as well. And not that everyone here likes to see us auditors, but tend to be fairly curious, right or wrong, or intrigued. It's a good place to start. In terms of where have you seen analytics take hold within your department? Is there certain types of techniques that are people using, or do you see them using different techniques to solve a problem?
It really is trying to understand who your stakeholder is. So we have auditors and investigators, very different types of people in our organization. So if we, well, one of the mistakes that we made early with the output of our one of our fraud models was to put it into a spreadsheet and send it to a bunch of investigators. And you can imagine how well that went over. So instead, we changed the interface and made it a little bit more intuitive and made it geospatial and red dots and draws their attention, and they get behind there and they see the information. The auditors, on the other hand, you can send them a spreadsheet and they're good to go. So I think it really depends on who it is that you're trying to solve this problem for to begin with.
And one of the things that we talked about is the question and not starting with the data. But eventually you get the data. You get the first cut of it after you make a request. So, Dominic, what challenge have you seen in terms of building analytic models when it comes down to now you get your first cut of data, then what can happen?
I think once you have the data, you got to figure out how, everyone's in agreement of what the actual question is. And then it's, to me, what I've seen as one of the biggest hang-ups is actually communicating effectively with leadership. It's all great to come up with an answer that's beautiful and makes a lot of sense to you, but if you want to have that in the hands of decision makers, they have to understand what they're looking for. So the tail end of analytics is kind of packaging up the analysis to make the answer glaringly obvious. And I think that's an area where, I've faced challenges in the past. It's not as easy as it sounds to go through a lot of analysis and think you've done a great job and have it fall on deaf ears or blind eyes to someone who really doesn't get what it is you tried to put in front of them.
I think the other trap we fall into when you start with data is we have a very limited scope of what we believe the data we need to answer our question is. And if we start there, we'll never get any wider than that. Yep. If I start with the question, for example, in mail theft, if the Postal Service doesn't want to give us operational data, there are other companies out there like Amazon and Netflix and Gamefly that have the same problems, and they'll give us data. So I don't have to work under the assumption anymore that the data that I get from my agency is the only data that I need or that I have access to. And so really when you start with the question, you're trying to recreate the environment where in the investigations the crime occurred or the oversight needs to be. What data is out there? I mean, we have social media data. So we had a case where a lady had bought a boat, and the name of her boat was Free Ride. And so basically in social media, she's admitting to her crime. Do I need anything more than that to understand that there's an issue? So that's just a good example of there's data out there besides, but if we're just solely focused on that data and my organization won't give it to me or the quality is not there, there's still other ways to solve the problem. And so that curiosity, that critical thinking, how can we recreate that environment? Where do we get data to help us do that?
So Dominic, when you were talking about the data, in terms of communicating with the executives, is it the definition of the metrics that's critical to understand, whether you're defining a citizen, customer, or what have you? Is that part of the challenge, or is it the scope of the analysis?
I think more of the scope of the analysis. We want to put together like an elegant answer sometimes to questions, and frankly, sometimes you have to simplify it, and it may not be the elegant answer you're looking for, but maybe all they're looking for is a number versus a beautiful distribution chart or something like that. I think that's what I'm talking about, is really considering the audience when you share the analytics. And among the team, I say you get creative and look at different ways of looking at the data, but I think it's more, I think I'm just really trying to drive drive home the point that the ultimate consumer and the ultimate value of good analytics is going to be good decisions made out of that. We should never forget that in our pursuit of, you assemble a bunch of curious people and they're going to come up with very creative and interesting ways of looking at the data. But at the end of the day, if you can't feed that data, feed that analysis to someone to actually drive a real decision that makes a real impact, then it's just an academic exercise. I think that's my point.
And what it does a lot of times is that if you add transparency to the equation, if in the case I used with you have 4 program areas and 100 investigators, if I continue to make that decision, but everybody else in the organization sees what's going on, somebody's going to tap me on the shoulder and say, why aren't you doing something over here? So in the example of your golf game, just because your wedge seems to be the most effective club for you, are you going to start putting with it? I mean, we're going to be tapping you on the shoulder and say, Bob, maybe you're going a little bit too far. Don't you see what's going on? So the transparency, along with the analytics, it really helps to keep people honest and focused, and that's what we're trying to do. And that's going to better train your model, better inform the public, and really all comes back to the biggest hurdle we have, which is the leadership and the people.
Yeah, and I think to ride on the point, I think you touched on something that I kind of was missing, is in addition to explaining what you have in the analysis and what it means, you should also be very careful about framing it as to what it is not and what you should not be interpreting from that analysis as well.
I would agree, and I do appreciate the golf advice. I'm willing to try anything. So we've got about 10 minutes left, and what I want to do is just open it up for some questions. We'll start here in the front.
Yeah, he's coming.
You could yell at me.
You would ask how many of us have an analytics division or program. And I think maybe I skewed the data because in some instances we just have people who capture analytics versus a program or a division. So I'm wondering if you can give some insight on the differences and then how to know if and when you need such a program or division.
Yeah, so I think you need both. The danger in doing just people that do analytics is when those people are gone, where is your program? So what we try to do is make the output of our model on a web-based application so that everybody in the organization has access to it. On the other hand, you're probably going to want a team of people that can really go deep with the lead. So if your model has an output and it tells you, and really what a good model should do is say something is odd, not right or wrong or good or bad, something is odd, then you need somebody sometimes to take it to the next step to find out, is this really a crime? Is this really an issue? Or is it not? And so I think you need to have a little both, but if you have one and not the other, I think that's a risk.
I think the concept of these kind of standalone data and analytics teams around government is more of a factor of where we are and the kind of the maturity of the field. Right now, I think ultimately what you want is to bake that capability in everything we do. And there's several parts of it. There's the data, the production of the data, the collection of the data, the aggregation of the data, the kind of the converting that data to usable analytical form, and there's the analyst, and there are different roles throughout that life cycle. And where I am now at GSA, those different pieces are played in different places. But eventually, everyone who's good at their job in the government should be an analyst and should have access to analytics. And I'd love to see more focus on kind of self-serve analytics. We should be building that capability throughout government to give people access to lightweight tools where they can tap into a depth of data, because the way it is now is really not scalable. We can answer a few questions with real good brain power, but we should have those tools at everyone's disposal to answer any question at any time. That's what we should be building towards.
And I think as you look, and if you're one of the lone cowboys who's doing analytics, I'm sure there are other people within the organization that are doing it. My challenge to you is kind of take a leadership role and step into trying to enable the organization to do analytics. Simple things like having lunch and learns, virtual team meetings, and sharing what analytic outputs that you're creating, what tools you're using, what techniques you're using, and start to share within the organization. And I think that will ultimately drive up what I would call the right type of infection that we want, and to help proliferate analytics through the organization. I think you also had a question?
So analytics could be...
It's working.
It's working?
Yeah.
Analytics could be a single-use question or single scenario question, or it could be for long-term business value.
Right.
What advices you have to offer to convert analytics into a repeatable process so that it delivers long-term business value?
Well, I think to start, you have to choose one or the other to get your success story. But then it's really going to depend on your organization and where your questions and your problems are. We started with a big question because we wanted an impact on the return. Once the organization began to understand what analytics can do, that now we have individual auditors, investigators saying, can you geocode my data and put it on a map for me so I can look at it in a different way, and that might take 24 hours. So we're now starting to do these one-offs because we have the simple tools and we have some data that we've collected, and so we can answer the questions as they come in. And then we can also equip the rest of the organization how to understand to use these tools to answer their own basic questions too. So I think you need to do both, but I think you just start with one to get a success story and then start building from there.
And I'm of the mind that we should be starting now thinking about how to democratize data and analytics within our organizations, and that just as publishing in books and knowledge used to be a dedicated profession by monks living up in a mountain somewhere. When we came out with the printing press, everyone had access, and knowledge exploded throughout the world. And I think we should think about this kind of the same way. Right now, we are those monks. These analytic teams are those monks on the mountaintop. But we should be constantly trying to find that printing press for the government so everyone can be smarter and have access to the same information as everyone else.
Then we go to the back of the room.
Good afternoon, Michael Joseph with Prime Dimensions. Great discussion. Kind of a two-prong question. One is about beginning with the question. With massive data sets and the ability to process massive data sets, there's the ability to go in there with sort of the, I don't know what I don't know. So how do you address that aspect of it? And then let me think about I forgot my other one, but if you hold that for a second, that'd be great.
So is the concern that the user will get lost in the vast amount of data?
I think he's challenging.
You don't want to limit your analysis to what your own questions could be, bias, et cetera. Yeah.
Absolutely. I will tell you that's why a lot of the software vendors are actually working with the hardware vendors so they can figure out how to massively parallel these analytic computations. So in the past, analytics was always, the process, part of the process of analytics was to do a sample. And that sample could be biased. So I think you'll see a lot of technological changes that will reduce the need to limit the amount of data that you can, A, throw at a model or use to instantiate and start to develop a new model. I'm not saying it's all figured out today, but that's where companies are going to, so you could put more data in the model. Dominic?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point not to be lost, because that's kind of the counter argument to you should start with a question. I think you still probably are starting with a question. I don't think you just throw a bunch of data in and just let the machine figure it out for you. But there's an important point to be made that the old notion of only collect what you need and that any more than that is a burden on those you're collecting it from, I think we need to throw that out the window and say, instead of asking people to, the real case, the real change that needs to be made is we need to stop doing these very structured kind of bottoms-up data collections where there's a lot getting lost in translation along the way, and try to get at the core data and try to grab these big data sets and make sense of those in a way we haven't been able to do in the past.
I would argue as you capture data today, some of the data that you're ingesting in your organization or over the web is not relevant today, right? So you capture data, as you look at it, ultimately, an analytic could be applied to score the data for its relevance to the organization. And that could be put in some sort of storage container, like, you could say an open source container like a Hadoop. Meanwhile, you could put your relevant data into a traditional database platform. But over time, events happen, things change. If we look at what's happened in the world, where someone, maybe you, were irrelevant to the government, something happened, one of your friends did something that wasn't so great, now all of a sudden your friend and you become relevant to the data. And that happens in the commercial world, where things change. So I think we do have to capture all the data. All of it may not be relevant today, but something could happen that may make that data relevant tomorrow, and you need to be able to recall that.
I think the question, the way that I'm hearing it, is who is committing healthcare fraud? That's the big question. If you ask 3 different investigators, they'll tell you, well, certain age, certain type of injuries, certain type of job, that's what I'm looking for. When we modeled the data, which was people that we knew had already committed the crime, we learned that if you lived in the state of Florida, the likelihood is higher that you're committing fraud. Now, that's something that we learned from the data, but we still had to ask the question of it, to begin with.
And now you're going to go probably pull data that may not have been in the original model to look at it in more detail. So now different data becomes relevant to that case. We probably have room for one more. Go for it.
It's a popular row right here.
Yeah.
So I heard that it's a concern that to get all the data access in certain level, like we don't get what we want always. So how outsourcing works for analytics projects? Is it always have to happen inside the organization, or outsourcing is a possibility for analytics projects?
You mean outsourcing to
Another company,
another
consulting
company?
Yeah, to do the assessment, do the evaluation.
That to me would only potentially exacerbate that problem, because you're getting that even farther removed from that. And it depends. If you're talking about outsourcing to a company that you're under contract with, or I guess we've done some outsourcing, I know, when it comes to like the healthcare analytics, and maybe there is some outsourcing that can help with the problem, where you export the problem to kind of someone viewed as neutral. I'm not sure a company working on your behalf is going to help that case, but perhaps academia, allowing academics to have access to healthcare data, for example, something we've done as a government pretty successfully, where they have kind of served as a more neutral party, and more, in some cases people trust academics more than they do government. I think that's, all debatable, but I don't know if that answers your question, but certainly outsourcing is something we have to do when just in general, if we're talking about data and analytics. I doubt there are very many analytical groups out there that aren't, at least in part, using contract support to do a lot of the analytics. But
Mostly it would be like in-house, according to you? Like you have to hire analytics guys to
We outsourced the predictive modeling, the data science, to a company at first. Now we've hired our own data scientists.
Okay.
All right, so we're at the end of the time. Dominic, any parting words?
parting words. Keep in mind what it is you're trying to accomplish and work backwards from there. In our case, I think as a government, we got a lot of questions we want to answer. Ask the right question and build from there, and make sure you're always thinking about the future of analytics in government. Analytics is it's kind of a buzzword now, but it is here to stay. We're only going to get better and better at it. Keep an eye on what it's going to look like in the future, and help bake it into your organizational DNA versus having it as this standalone thing that only these really smart people do.
Ryan?
You're going to ruffle some feathers. You're going to get a bloody nose. You should take that as you're making progress, and it's a good thing. So,
And I'll leave you with Dominic. I'm going to use your quote. The human brain is wired for survival, not wired for the truth.
yeah.
I'm gonna challenge you all.
Did you tweet that?
Yeah, I'm going to challenge you all to go down this road. I think analytics will become mainstream. It will be as democratized as a suite of Office products is on your desktop. I believe in the future, each one of you will be consuming and using analytics. Be part of it. So that's my challenge. All right.
Thanks. Thank you.